Hi, my name is Anastasia Allen. I'm the Executive Director at Navigate STL Schools, and welcome to Navigate STL Schools, a podcast. We are sitting down today with Roosevelt. And Roosevelt, you are with the Quality Schools Coalition, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Awesome. So we like to get started with the same question for everyone. Tell me a little bit about your education story, like
Sure.
K-12. How did it start?
Yeah, so I'm actually from Phoenix, Arizona. So I grew up there and went to school up through middle school there. And we grew up, it was me, my dad, and my brother. So we actually grew up pretty poor. And my mom wasn't in the picture. My dad actually had some substance abuse issues. And so we went to, an urban school district in Kansas City. I'm sorry, in Phoenix, Arizona. And I would say, through elementary school, I was a great student. I've always been a big reader, and so I, enjoyed school and did well in school. Around middle school is when things got a little dicey. I really stopped kind of engaging in school. Started, running with people called a bad crowd then, and things like that. So I really got disengaged with school. My brother did really well because he was into basketball, so that kind of kept him engaged. That kind of continued through high school, and I like to tell people all the time. We actually moved from Phoenix over to a small town in Kansas called Independence, Kansas, only about 12,000 people. That's where I went to high school, and that's where I graduated. And I tell people all the time, I graduated 152nd out of 157 people. So only 5 people had a worse grade than I did, and I just wasn't very involved. I, worked a full-time job. I didn't go to school a lot. And in fact, I remember there was a teacher there specifically that Mr. Capes. He was a chemistry teacher, and I used to just go and walk him in school, walk in class, sit in the back and just read my book to the whole class and not do any work. I was great at a test. Like, give me a test, I'd knock it out. Big reader, so I was good, with the vocabulary and all that, but I just wasn't very engaged in school. So it wasn't really until I got older and we got pregnant pretty early with our oldest daughter and I got into kind of my undergraduate year that I really got, more engaged in education and saw the value of it. But starting out K through 12 was not.
It was rocky.
It was rocky. Wasn't my thing.
So how a two-parter, how did that spark your work that you currently do now, and what do you do?
Yeah. So I'll talk about I'll talk about what I do first. So I'm the vice president of Advocacy for Quality Schools Coalition. And what I do currently is I do a lot of, I call relationship building with community groups, but also parents to get them engaged in our legislative priorities. So I like to say my job is 3 things. First, my biggest job is just to inform parents. So whether you like what we're doing or not, you should know what's going on. My second goal is to get feedback from parents and engage parents. What's important to you, whether that's a specific piece of legislation or something that's affecting their school or their students specifically. And then my third one is to turn people into advocates if they want to. I have a little bit of an organizing background, so I like to empower people to act if they're really on board and they're like, oh, this is great, try to give them something to do. But I think how this informs me is what people tell you like education, it's important to get a job, and all those things are really true. I think what I have found between, once we had our daughter and both me and then my wife were here in Kansas City. I was working at dry cleaners. I was working in factories. Thought I was going to go to the Army for a hot minute before they said, no, we don't want you, Roosevelt. And I really had to take a step back and think about, like, what do I want to do? And I didn't want to keep working in factories. And so I think what education, people tell you, like, it's to get a job. But what I found going through my undergraduate year and then eventually into my master's degree was really education is for expanding your mind, and it creates so many opportunities that aren't just financial, but opportunities for your own growth. That I think college isn't for everybody. I'm not going to say that, but if it is for you, I always tell my oldest daughter, who's 22 now, your undergraduate year is for you. That's for your knowledge. That's for you to understand the world. It's for you to get experience. Go get your master's degree or whatever if you figure out what you want to do, but it's not to get a job, right? So I think education just opens those doors and expands your horizon. When you grow up poor, it's very easy to have a very siloed kind of, and you think everything looks exactly like, where you grow up. But, it really expanded my.
So what's the Quality Schools Coalition?
Yeah, so we're a 501c4 organization, which means we actually do some lobbying for specific legislation, and we write legislation, and we try to get legislation approved. Our legislation is all geared towards improving public education, the public education system. So we're not pro-charter, we're not pro-traditional district. It's public education that we're trying to improve. So, yeah.
And this is a statewide organization, correct?
Yes, thank you.
So where do you guys operate specifically? Like, are there the specific areas of the state? Are you only covering urban areas, or are you just doing all of Missouri?
So all of us are based, we're only a 4-person team, so we're all based in Kansas City. A couple of our members, the VP and the executive director, one of our VPs, they spend a lot of time in Jefferson City as we're talking about legislation. My job, as far as advocacy, I spend most of my time either in Kansas City or St. Louis, and starting to branch out over into the Springfield area. So right now, a big bulk of we're in Jefferson City, mostly in St. Louis, and then in Kansas City is where we spend most of our time right now.
So thinking about that, you talked about this idea of informing parents. Why is what you do controversial? I know we spoke earlier on about there just being a lot of people that are not for the kind of work that you guys do at the Quality Coalition. So why is it controversial?
I don't think it is actually controversial. So, and I'll talk about our bill that we currently have right now. It's called the Quality Education Act, and I can tell you that, in polling, 84% of Missourians, actually approve of some of the work we're doing. Right. When I go and talk to parents, the things that we're talking about right now are very common sense things. So for parents and for I think the general public, this isn't controversial. I think when you say controversial, anytime you are disrupting the status quo, anytime you're trying to do something different, then you can often get labeled as controversial, right? Because change is hard, right? And I like to say people like to have this narrative that people just fight change, and I don't believe that. I think people get anxious about change because of the fear that they might lose something. You're always going to lose something in change, right? Somebody's going to lose something, right? So when we're coming in and we want to disrupt the status quo because it's not working, I think that's what makes us controversial. But if you talk to the everyday
Missouri.
parent, it's not, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about our current legislation and past legislation, like, duh, why are you wasting my time, Roosevelt? Why aren't we doing this already, right? So I don't know that it's controversial unless we make it controversial.
So you mentioned the Quality Education Act. Is that correct?
Yep.
What is that?
So the Quality Education Act does 3 things. It essentially replaces the current accountability system. And when I say accountability system, I'm talking about the Missouri School Improvement Program.
Okay.
It's in its 6th iteration called MSIP 6, and this is the program that the state uses to both accredit schools but also kind of give them a grade and tell them how they're doing. So an APR score. They just released APR scores just last week on Tuesday, and a lot of schools saw a pretty big decline. So this piece of legislation replaces that. It replaces it for a few reasons, because if the school improvement program's purpose is to improve schools, it hasn't done that. Missouri has declined on academics year after year. It went from being 24th among 51 states, including the District of Columbia, down to 42nd. 3 in 10 students in Missouri.
Wait, I'm sorry, 42nd?
42nd, yes.
Oh, wow. So what, so there are six states in worse, to do a callback to your earlier statement. That's insane. Okay.
Yep. So 3 in 10 students are reading on grade level by the 4th grade. 1 in 10 black students are reading on grade level by the 4th grade. There's a 25-point gap between white students and black students. And so what this does is there's 3 basic components of it. It changes the system. It makes it so that academics are a bigger part of a school's overall score. So it makes it so that 90% of a school's score, right now, a school gets graded on not only how students do, but also the paperwork they turn in, and some other compliance issues. This just focuses strictly on academics. So it makes what we call status and growth a bigger part of that 90% of a grade. Right now, it's only 48%. So.
Okay. Before we get into the rest of that, for the lay people, what's growth?
Yeah, so so if you take a test, you take the MAP test, and schools get graded on how well those students do on those MAP tests. There are kind of 2 numbers that are in there right now. One is your status, so that is where a student is coming in right now taking that test. The other number is growth, and growth is how a student does year over year, how much they've learned in a year. So currently, in the current MSIP program, there's only about 48% of a school's overall grade is made up of those two scores. So you're not actually getting a full story of how students are doing. Our bill actually makes growth a bigger part of that, and growth is important because what we know is, coming out of COVID, students are already behind. Students of color, lower income students are even further behind, right? And it tells a bigger story because what we find is that, especially for urban schools and schools that serve those students of low income, even though you would look at their APR score and it wouldn't look good, if you dug down into that a little deeper and saw their growth score, you would see that they're taking some of the students, even though they might not be at the fourth grade level, sometimes they're taking them from a first grade reading level up to a second or third grade reading level, but they're not getting credit for that. They're getting penalized for that, right? So this makes growth a bigger part of that overall score. What we hope it does is it also incentivizes schools to take that time to go back and focus on those students who have the most needs and who are furthest behind. So that's kind of the second thing it does. So that's the big thing is we change that APR score so that a bigger part of it is actually student academics, with a majority of that coming from student growth, which we feel like is the biggest indicator of how a school's doing. The second thing it does is it creates a clear and understandable grading system. So it goes to an A through F system for all school districts and all schools. So every school, as well as the school district, charters and traditional public schools, will get an A through F. Right now it's very easy to find, not very easy. You can find district level data. It's a little harder on the school level. And we feel like obviously an A through F is easy to understand for parents. It's much harder when you look at whether, right now some of the languages, are they on the floor, are they approaching, and these aren't really intuitive for parents. And then the third thing it does is it creates a set of interventions for consistently underperforming schools. And so schools that consistently underperform, there are resources available for those schools that have been tried and tested as resources that will benefit them. And it's a progressive kind of intervention from 3 to 5 years if that school continues to underperform.
Awesome. So when you talk about like these grades and this idea of it being easier to find, it kind of sparks this idea of transparency. Like, how is this beneficial for schools, particularly like community-based schools, where you do see some of the lower performing students being, oh gosh, I don't know a nice word to say, but kind of warehoused in these areas where they do tend to have these lower scores? Like, how does that help them to improve? How does that help parents who may be in areas where they don't necessarily have choices to go to different programs that are higher performing? Is it better for schools in these neighborhood areas because it's going to show how much the students are growing in these environments, or could it end up actually making flight from these areas worse?
So I'll say a couple of things. So first, to your first question, yes, in a lot of ways, the school districts that get labeled as failing oftentimes are where we see often students who have the most growth. So again, those students aren't on grade level, and they're not on grade level for a lot of reasons, a lot of systemic barriers, right? But those teachers are taking those students and actually growing those students at a faster rate than oftentimes like their suburban counterparts, right? A lot of those students are coming in where they are and they're staying where they are. While a lot of urban districts and districts that serve lower income students are actually growing those students at a lot faster pace. So in some ways, yes, for some schools, it's gonna show the actual work that they're doing and not penalize them for, not having students that come in ready to go. As far as that question about flight, so what we know is parents they base their school choice on a lot of different reasons. Academics isn't always the number one. School safety, climate and culture, convenience, all these things weigh into a parent's decision. So I don't know that I can't imagine seeing a school district who gets a low grade. And I can tell you that I've done a fair amount of presentations for parents, and some even at lower performing schools. And those parents are aware that their school is not performing. They're aware of some of the issues. So it's not like they don't know this, right? And so they make those choices to keep their kids in school, for whatever reason, whether those are extracurricular activities, whether it's, this is a performing arts, whatever the case may be. So there's lots of reasons why parents choose to keep their kid in that school. What we believe is that parents should have that information. They should know it so they're making a decision with all the available, or at least as much available information as they possibly can.
So when you think about like the scope of issues, you've touched on reading a little bit. What are some other just larger scale issues that a program like the Quality Education Act could like help expose and bring more resources to?
Yeah, so I think people often ask like, why start here? This isn't like the sexiest thing when you start talking about like accountability system. Parents are like, what? And you got to walk them through it. But I think what's important, why this is important, is because obviously for this transparency reason, but also I think it's important so that we actually understand where we are and understand where the schools that are doing well with students, what they're doing to actually improve those students and how they're doing. It's really hard to get a real clear understanding of exactly where schools are, and it's hard to make an apples to apples comparison right now. So when that can come into play later on as we talk about school funding and other bigger issues, right? But I think understanding, and everybody, to the extent that we can, understands, even legislators, right? Legislators who look at APR scores or look at this floor and approaching and all these other terms are like, I don't actually know what that means, and I don't have a lot of faith that this is telling me the full story, right? So in order to even have a conversation about bigger picture things, you have to start with clear, transparent, easily understood data, right? And that's where we're starting right here.
So clear, transparent, easily understood data for parents. If parents want to get involved in this work, how can they get involved?
Hit me up. I got work for you to do, but no, you can go. We actually have a website that is. We have a couple websites. So there's QualitySchoolsCoalition.org, which is our home base. If you want to learn more about the Quality Education Act, you can go to QualityEducationActMo.org. And there's actually a little button on there that says get involved. You click that and you get a call from me. So either one of those. We have a really good, we're starting this kind of parent advisory kind of council. I like to call them consultants because we actually get their feedback. We're not just asking them to do things. We have actually a meeting tonight in Kansas City with this group, and they actually help inform me on my advocacy strategy and legislative priorities that are important to them. So there's lots of ways to get involved. We're going to be we have actually a hearing for our bill, which is HB 558 on Wednesday in Jeff City. So if you want to come down and hear that or provide some testimony or just want to learn more, just check out the website.
And I have a question. This is kind of like backtracking, but it's just like in my head, and I'm not going to rest unless I get it out. A smart kid is going to be smart wherever you put them. So how does having a growth score weigh more into a school's grade actually impact these schools where we think that, oh my gosh, everybody here is an A student, they must be doing something right? Do you think that it equals the playing field in that, right? Because if a smart kid is smart, you're not really going to grow them that much over the course of a particular year versus a kid who has to go from a first grade reading level to try to get to a fourth grade reading level. Is that going to help even out some of these like misconceptions around what it means to have a quality school?
I would say absolutely. So I think sometimes in a lot of ways when we focus so much on status, which is the other one that's not growth, right, it can often mask actually what's really going on. So if you have a lot of students, and we see this oftentimes, and I'll say some of our suburban districts where students are coming in, they have fewer barriers, they come in and they score well as far as status, right? So what some parents do who have a student who may be behind see those schools and say, all right, I'm going to put my kid in that school because they have great test scores. What they don't know is that sometimes those schools are the ones that don't pay attention to growth, that don't actually take the time to get students caught up. And they have a very specific model to say, we're moving forward. Like either you got it or you don't, right? So parents move their kids sometimes into these districts thinking, oh, it's a great school. It's going to be great for my kid because they got great test scores. What they don't know is if their students are already behind, they're just going to get further and further behind. And it's actually may not be the best fit for them. So again, this tells the whole story about what's going on in the school so that parents can make that decision. If your student's behind and you do have that option to look at schools, you might want to look at a high growth school, right? If your student is one of those smart kids and is, has a high academic status, then maybe a growth school isn't what you're looking for, right? But having that information, I think, is important for parents.
So how do parents find you? You said hit you up. How do we find you?
So you can hit me up directly at Roosevelt at QualitySchoolsCoalition.org. That's my email address. But also you can just go to the website and it has all of our bios and information, which is QualitySchoolsCoalition.org.
Well, knowing that you spend a little bit of your time here, but you're spread throughout the state, what is, as we're wrapping up, the thing that gives you hope about the future of education in St. Louis or the future of education in Missouri now that we are, what, 47th?
42nd,
42nd.
Don't, hey.
42nd. We're up there. We're a little higher.
I think, what I see sometimes, well, first, I think at the legislative level, I think there is some at times bipartisanship. It's not often, but we're seeing a little bit more of that more often, which is a good sign around education issues. I think I'm hoping, this is my naivete here, that people that work in this space, like you and some others and myself, I feel like there is somewhat of a different mindset, of more of a cooperative mindset, less of a ego-driven territorial mindset. And when I think about education, it's what's called an adaptive challenge, which is like this big challenge that doesn't have a real easy technical solution. And the only way you can actually fix adaptive challenges is by getting everybody to the table and getting all the voices heard and keeping everybody, to the extent that they want to, engaged. And so I see more of that as we move forward, and I'm hoping I see more of that with some of the up and coming leaders and people that are stepping into this space, that there's more opportunity to cooperate and work together for the greater good, versus like this is my territory and I'm not going to let anybody step on it, no matter what that means for students. So
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Looking forward to see all the great work you guys are going to do in the state, and hopefully have you back on again.
Anytime.
All right. Thank you for listening to Navigate STL Schools, a podcast. We'll see you next episode.